They called it a crusade, but there were no knights, no armor, no kings, just children. It was the year 1212. Europe was weary, bloodied by decades of crusades that promised salvation but delivered only ash and ruin. The Holy Land remained distant, unconquered, and in that vacuum of war, despair, and divine silence, something strange began to spread. Stories of a boy in France, or was it Germany, a shepherd named Stephen, or a boy named Nicholas, or perhaps neither. The records are murky, conflicting, some written decades later, deliberately erased. But the core of the legend is always the same. A child no older than 12 or 13 claims to have received a vision from God. He will lead a new crusade, one not waged by warriors, but by the pure. The innocent children would succeed where armies had failed, and thousands believed, not just peasants, but priests, clergy, even lords. Towns emptied. Boys and girls, some no older than 7, began marching south, singing hymns, chanting Latin prayers. They carried no weapons. They brought no food, because they believed the sea would part for them, that God himself would open the Mediterranean like the Red Sea, and lead them to Jerusalem. But the sea did not part, and God said nothing. So what happened to them? Some chronicles claim they reached Marseille, others say Genoa. There they waited and waited, starving. Some turned back, others died. And then 2 merchants offered ships free passage for the glory of God. They said 7 ships filled with children. None returned. What happened next is one of the most disturbing, unsolved events in medieval history. 2 of the ships were wrecked in a storm near Sardinia. All on board drowned. The remaining 5 disappeared into the open sea, vanished. For months, there was silence, then whispers. Years later, in obscure letters and forgotten monastery records, a horrifying truth began to surface. The ships never reached the Holy Land. They reached North Africa, and there, the children were sold into slavery. It was no crusade, it was a trap. The merchants, later named in some accounts as Hugo Farias and William Porcus, were not men of faith. They were traffickers. The entire children's crusade, some now believe, was exploited if not orchestrated, to supply the booming Mediterranean slave markets. Thousands of children, gone not martyred, but commodified. And here's where it gets darker. Why weren't the church records louder? Why weren't the merchants punished? Why did the Pope himself, Innocent III, respond only by saying, "These children put us to shame"? Shame, not grief, not rage, not justice, just shame. Was that guilt or complicity? Because the medieval church had long benefited from the sale of infidels. In times of peace and war, the line between holy conquest and economic incentive blurred constantly. Slavery wasn't outlawed. It was regulated. Was the church silenced because it had seen this happen before, or because it had helped make it happen? And what of the children who survived? Some accounts claim that a few scattered survivors returned years later, scarred, malnourished, changed beyond recognition. They spoke of prisons, beatings, of masters who forced them to forget their names, their prayers, their language. But those were only rumors. Their testimonies, if they were real, never made it into official canon. We know more about the myth than the people, and that is the tragedy. Because when you strip away the miracle, the prophecy, the holy mission, what you have is a mass disappearance of an essence of lives erased under the banner of divine war. So we must ask, was the children's crusade a spontaneous act of faith, or one of the earliest recorded cases of organized religious exploitation? And why is it still, to this day, not taught in full? What else was buried with them?
And then, as centuries passed, the story began to change. The children's crusade, once whispered with horror, became legend, a strange parable, a footnote in textbooks. Some historians even began to dismiss it as exaggerated or outright fabricated. Surely, they argued, no one would let thousands of children march across Europe, unsupervised, toward war. But would they? Let us not forget the context. Medieval Europe was a continent ruled by fear, famine, and unquestioned faith. In a world where the church was above kings, where miracles were policy, where death lurked in every winter, the unbelievable was believable. And here's where the contradiction lies. Some scholars believe the children's crusade wasn't made up, but intentionally that over time, the church, embarrassed, exposed, reshaped the story into something less damning, something poetic, a tale of innocent zeal, a tragic mistake, not a deliberate betrayal. but fragments of the truth still survive in court records, tax registers, letters from coastal towns that suddenly saw hundreds of new slaves in the years following. 1212. Not adult prisoners, not enemy captives, children from France, from the Rhineland, from villages that never saw their sons or daughters again. So the question becomes, was this a crusade or a cover-up? And it doesn't end there. In 1230, barely a generation later, reports of another child-led movement emerged. Again, a charismatic youth claiming visions. Again, hundreds, some say thousands, followed him. They disappeared. Could it be copycats, delusion, or was something, or someone, encouraging these movements for hidden gain? We know that in certain port cities, officials were paid to look the other way, that slave brokers received letters in advance, knowing when ships were coming and how many bodies to expect. This wasn't coincidence. It was infrastructure. And if that's true, then we're not talking about a failed crusade anymore. We're talking about the systematic disappearance and sale of children under the name of God, a medieval trafficking network, cloaked in divine language, funded by noble families, enabled by silence, and erased by history. So now we are left with nothing but shadows. No mass graves, no official apologies, only a question, echoing across 800 years. Did thousands of children really vanish in 1212? Or did we let them vanish because their truth was too inconvenient? What else has the Church and history itself chosen to forget?
So we are left with nothing but shadows. No mass graves, no full records, no monuments bearing their names, only fragmented chronicles secondhand, passed down by monks who perhaps didn't even witness the events themselves. Names are scarce. Testimonies are gone. The most detailed account we have is from a cleric who wrote 20 years after it happened. Even he admitted. The truth is difficult to know, but the pain was real. Thousands of families across Europe, from Cologne, from Tours, from the Alps, never saw their children again. Some others waited for decades. Some fathers were told their sons died gloriously in battle, though no battle ever took place. A few received letters, scattered, broken, smuggled from across the sea, written by trembling hands, in foreign tongues, with barely legible Latin. One letter read, "We were deceived. There was no crusade. There were no miracles. Only chains." Imagine receiving that. Imagine knowing your child was taken, not by heathens, but by the very men who claimed to speak for God. Nothing was done. Why? Because to confront the truth would have been to dismantle the myth. To admit the Church had failed, or worse, enabled the betrayal, would have shaken the foundations of Europe itself. So instead, the world buried the story in layers of allegory. They turned tragedy into theology. They transformed victims into martyrs, and the perpetrators disappeared into history. But patterns don't lie. This wasn't an isolated event. It echoed into the centuries that followed. Children trafficked during the Reconquista, under papal protection. Orphans deported during later crusades to serve Christendom. Innocents sacrificed again and again in the name of faith, empire, and order. Was this the beginning of institutionalized, religiously justified exploitation? And if so, what does that make the Children's Crusade? A miracle, a legend, or a crime so large, so damning, that it had to be forgotten? Ask yourself this. Why is this not taught in schools? Why do we memorize the names of kings and popes, but not the children who vanished without a trace? Is it because they were too young to matter? Too powerless to be remembered? Or is it because their disappearance would force us to rewrite the story of the Middle Ages entirely? Would force us to admit that beneath the golden crosses and the holy hymns lay chains and silence, and a truth too dangerous for the Church and perhaps even for us to speak aloud? So we end with this. The Children's Crusade did happen. Whether 3,000 or 30,000, whether led by vision or manipulation, they marched, they vanished, and history let them go. But we don't have to. We can remember them. We can question what we were told, and we can finally ask whose voices have been erased from our past, so that power could preserve its future.